In this section, we discuss image sampling, which is the very core of V-Ray and any other rendering engine. This is an extremely vast subject to explore, and I'll be trying to do my best not to confuse you and discuss it in a simple and effective way. If loosely defined, image sampling is the process of generating a 2D image out of the information gathered from a 3D scene. Now, what we described is also known as ray tracing. V-Ray, like almost all other render engines, is a ray tracer. If I want to construct a more technical definition of ray tracing, I would say it is the process of tracing rays from the camera for each pixel and calculating the color of that pixel. So if we have the color value for all the pixels, we can simply put those pixels together and produce the final image. Now, let's see how ray tracing works in a bit more visual manner. I'll be using these pictures, and one of them is from Chaos Group. So first, the primary rays are shot from the camera through each pixel of the image plane to find out what part of the scene each pixel covers. When I say image plane, I mean this grid in front of the camera, which is called a internal frame buffer sometimes, where each square represents one single pixel. Now, keep this in mind. This is basically our final image, right? Now, I'm going to simplify this a bit and say that first, the primary or the camera rays, these red rays, are sent out from the camera into the scene for each individual pixel. And the first thing these rays do is to find out what is in the view. Now that we have this very basic information about what is going to be visible in the final render, we can start tracing secondary rays to analyze the exact color of each pixel. So the primary rays from the camera were to realize what will be visible in the scene, and the secondary rays are to give us the exact color of each pixel in the scene. So these rays include reflection rays, refraction rays, shadow rays, and so on. Now, because there are so many factors affecting the overall color value of a pixel, if you imagine a pixel belonging to a sphere, for example, in the scene, a color value for that pixel will be constructed from the light intensity, the direction of the light that's coming, the surface properties, whether it's shiny or matte or has transparent qualities or not, the camera angle we see that object from, and so many other things. I'm oversimplifying everything here and intentionally including some errors in technicalities to be able to explain the concept. But I have to, otherwise the only thing you would learn from this lesson is more confusion. So when a primary ray hits a point, a sample will be created. Now imagine there might be hundreds of samples per pixel. From each sample, we start tracing secondary rays. Which secondary rays will be traced depends on the surface properties. So if the surface is not refractive, for example, there is no need for secondary refractive rays for that particular surface. Shadow rays are traced from each point or sample towards each light in the scene. If there is no obstacle between that point and the light, that point would be in direct illumination, and if there is something between that point and the light, it will be in shadows. For reflection rays, if the surface has specular reflective properties, secondary reflection rays will be shot into the scene to gather information about what should be reflected in this object. Secondary rays will be traced in a similar process for other effects like refraction, subsurface scattering, and other stuff. In order to avoid confusion, I'm not gonna get into detail about them right now. Now, these secondary rays will continue bouncing in the scene and gathering information about the scene until we have good enough samples to have a color value for each pixel. Basically, from averaging all the sample values, we can decide the final color value of the pixel. Now we can simply put those pixels together and have a final render or image. One of the purposes of image sampling in general is to improve anti-aliasing. As I mentioned, for each pixel we shot numerous amount of primary rays, and for each ray there would be a sample created. From those samples we send out secondary rays to gather information, and finally from averaging all the samples we get the final color value for that pixel. Now, this approach will allow us to avoid having jagged edges around our object and also in our texture that have a certain level of contrast and detail. Imagine if for each pixel we only had one sample, so only one primary ray. As there might be geometry detail or texture detail smaller than 1 pixel, only one sample per pixel wouldn't suffice, and the color value for that pixel would be probably wrong. To give us the smooth final result, image sampling not only averages the samples in 1 pixel, it also tries to take a look around that pixel and gather some information from neighboring samples, and based on that information, the final color value for that pixel will be determined. Now let me show you two renders with and without anti-aliasing. In the first render we have anti-aliasing in the scene. You can see the edges are smooth and we get a smooth final result. In the second render I have decreased the number of samples per pixel to only 1, so we don't have any anti-aliasing. And I have done that simply by disabling max subdivisions in my image sampler settings and putting the minimum subdivision to 1. And also I've changed some other settings to make sure I can show you the exact result that I'm after. So in this image we don't have any anti-aliasing, there isn't any averaging of samples going on. That's why the final image is so rough and the edges are jagged. Let me zoom in around this leg here and compare the image with anti-aliasing and the one without it. In the one without anti-aliasing, you can see we have these rough, jagged edges, and the software doesn't try to somehow mix the white color of the leg and the blue colors of the wall. But in the render with anti-aliasing, you can see the software tries to adjust the color of the boundary pixels. So instead of pure white for these pixels, we get a combination of white and blue to make sure the edges would be smooth on the eyes. When we have these jagged edges, in this situation we say the image is aliased. Now we need to do something to counter this problem. We anti-alias by increasing the number of samples per pixel, and this is done by increasing the max subdiv number in our image sampler setting, and in this case bucket image sampler, which is the subject of discussion for our next lesson. So that's about ray tracing, image sampling, and anti-aliasing. I would suggest you go ahead and continue watching the rest of this section and then come back here and watch this introductory lesson again if you had any problem comprehending the subject. Also, if you want to dig deeper, there is a resource online, and there are other websites, but this one is in particular is really great. If you go to scratchapixel.com, you can find detailed lessons about all the fundamentals of computer graphics. Our subject was ray tracing, and there is a lesson here called an overview of ray tracing rendering technique. And here you can find tons of information about ray tracing and the mathematics and codes behind it. Perfect. See you in the next lesson.